by the time they're there, like, Lynn is basically unconscious. They rush her inside, and the doctors and nurses, they try to do everything they can to stabilize Lynn. But as soon as she was admitted, it was like her condition only got worse and worse. And that night, she slipped into a coma, and then she died. Wu was devastated. He and the neighbor took Lynn's body, put it back on the donkey cart, and brought it back to their town. And then Wu began setting up for a funeral service. So in Taiwan, it's customary during funerals to have the body of the loved one be brought into the house where it stays for 7 days before they're cremated. And so Wu, after getting Lynn's body back home, he put her into a coffin, set her up in the living room, and then over the next several days, Wu was at home next to his dead wife as friends and family, and even the neighbors who, clearly had some issue with Wu. They all came in to pay their respects. And while this was happening, Wu, who was already devastated at the loss of his wife, as he would listen to people come in and pray over the body and sort of talk to the body as if she was still alive and talk about how wonderful she was, it really hit Wu hard because it was like he was suddenly realizing how different his life was going to be without his wife. Lynn was a very simple woman. She was illiterate, she really didn't travel, and she was very introverted and quiet, but she was a wonderful wife. She took care of Wu, she cared about him deeply, she was a wonderful cook, and just generally, she made people around her feel safe and happy. And so, Wu, it's like he just found himself over and over having these fits of just crying. Like he can't believe that Lynn is now gone. But on the third day after Lynn had passed away, so now we're about halfway through this funeral service, which takes about a week, Wu was in his living room dealing with this overwhelming sadness about losing his wife, and there's this procession of people coming in and out of the house. And as Wu was sitting there, there was sort of a cadence and a rhythm to how the days were going. But at some point, it was like everybody in the room just suddenly went completely silent. And then people began to gasp. And Wu, he was sort of head down, dealing with his sadness, and he sort of noticed the change in the room, and he heard people gasping, and he looked up, and he noticed a few of the mourners. They weren't just gasping, they were open-mouthed and horrified, and they were looking at the casket. And so Wu went from the mourners, and he looks over at the casket, and there, in this open casket, is Lynn, except now she's sitting upright, looking around the room, clearly alive. Now, at first, Wu's reaction was, oh my goodness, my wife must have just slipped into a really deep coma, so deep that the doctors could not distinguish it from death. And so this is a mistake. Like, she was never dead. She's just, waking up from her coma. But at the same time, as Wu's having this immediate reaction to seeing his wife sitting up in her coffin, he's thinking, but over these 3 days that I've not left her side, I've been with her body the whole time. She's not moved, she's not made a sound, she's certainly not had anything to eat or drink. Like, this just doesn't seem possible. And so Wu and the other mourners, after the shock of seeing this sort of wore off, everybody kind of jumped into action, and they rushed over to the casket, and they very gently lifted Lynn out of the casket, and they carried her over to her bed, and they laid her down, and Lynn immediately kind of gestured for water. She was too weak to speak. She had lost a bunch of weight, but she's gesturing for water, and so they give her some water, and she sips the water, and everyone's looking at Wu like, we have to get her to the hospital. Like, what else can we possibly do? But Wu, he's looking at his wife, and she's so frail. She really seems like now she is on the precipice of dying here. And he's thinking, she can't survive another donkey cart ride to the hospital. And so we have to keep her here and hope that she, recovers enough that maybe in a day or two we could bring her to the hospital, but certainly not now. And so over the next couple of hours, Wu, along with some friends and family, just stayed by Lynn's bedside, constantly checking on her, making sure she really was alive. And, she was, albeit, very subdued, but she continued to drink water and had a little food. And amazingly, over the span of only a few hours, Lynn went from basically literally being dead to actually seeming to get a whole lot better. In fact, to the point where, Lynn was actually sitting up in bed and, stretching and moving around as if she was completely fine. In fact, in Wu's opinion, it almost seemed like within a few hours, she was actually physically almost better off than she was normally when she was alive. Like, it was a miracle how quickly she was recovering. And so by that night, when Lynn really did seem like she was effectively back to her normal self, the mourners all left and said, okay, well, I guess Lynn's okay. And they left, and then it was just Wu and Lynn. And Wu had no idea how to handle any of this. He was just so grateful that his wife was alive, even though, again, none of this made any sense. Like, this is so shocking. but he's just grateful that she's alive. The next day, when they woke up, Lynn was so much better that she was out of bed, walking around the house, really excited to face the day. And Wu's like, dude, you were dead yesterday. Like, what's going on here? But Lynn said to him, hey, I want to go out on a walk. You want to go on a walk with me, go to the temple? And Wu, he's looking at Lynn, still like unable to comprehend what's happened here. But he's thinking, she does seem like she's in great health right now. And if she wants to go for a walk, great, I'll go with her. And so the two of them went outside and they began to walk. And as they're walking, Wu, he's a pretty athletic guy, remember? He found himself barely able to keep pace with Lynn, who was like speed walking towards the temple. And on top of that, as they're walking and Wu's like, gassed as he's trying to keep up with his wife, periodically neighbors would, wave to Lynn and Wu, and for just a brief second they would chat. And as Wu listened to Lynn speak, he began to notice something really strange. That Lynn, maybe he didn't notice it before, but he was definitely noticing it when she was speaking to other people. She just sounded different, like her accent was different. It did not sound like his wife. And the weirdness around Lynn's miraculous recovery only got more weird over time. Before Lynn died and came back to life, she had been illiterate. But now, she was not only able to read, but she could also read and speak fluent Mandarin, a language she didn't know before she died. Also, Lynn used to be a really skilled cook who loved cooking meat dishes in particular. But now that Lynn has recovered, she no longer wanted to eat meat. She said she was a vegetarian and basically stopped cooking. Also, Lynn began speaking with real authority about the professions of accounting and bookkeeping. And then also she advised her husband to quit his job as an engineer and open up a building materials shop in town because there was a real need for it and he'd make real money that way. And believe it or not, like Wu, he doesn't understand what's going on with his wife, but she really seemed like a force to be reckoned with now. And however she had gained all this extra knowledge, it really seemed like she was sharp these days. And so he was like, all right. And he quits his job as an engineer, opens up this building materials shop, and really quickly, he and his wife began making real money, more money than they had ever made before. And while all this was happening, Wu and Lynn became the biggest curiosity in town. The story of how Lynn had miraculously come back to life with all these bizarre personality changes, not only was that spreading all around town, but it eventually spread all across the country. It was like everybody was talking about Lynn. In fact, this story spread so far that it eventually reached the Taiwanese government. And when they heard about it, they were so intrigued, they decided they would investigate. And so on March 17th, 1962, the Taiwanese government sent for Lynn. And Lynn was very happy to go. She was ready to tell her story and answer any questions they had. This was all just kind of exciting. The idea that the government wanted to know how she had made this unbelievable recovery. And so the government, they scoop her up and they bring her to this army hospital and they tell her she's going to be meeting with the chief physician there. And so the chief physician, he's inside of the room. He's waiting for Lynn. He's never met her before. He's only been told roughly what the story is. There's this woman who's acting really funny after coming back from the dead. And okay, fine, I'm going to talk to her and see what's going on. And so Lynn, she walks in the room and the chief physician, he looks at her. She's an ordinary looking woman and she walks over to him. And before he can even begin a line of questioning, Lynn looks at him like with a double take, like there's a moment of recognition. And she says to the chief physician, "Uncle?" And the chief physician is like, "Why are you calling me uncle?" And then Lynn would go on to explain why she had just called him uncle. And the chief physician was so shocked by her story that he left the room and he called for his wife. And then when his wife came to the hospital, he didn't tell her what was going on. He just said, "Come with me." She walks into the room with the chief physician, he and his wife, and Lynn, who's never met this woman, and the woman has never met Lynn, they see each other for the first time, and Lynn looks at her and just goes, "Auntie." And it was at this point that Lynn revealed to the chief physician and his wife that Lynn really was not her name. That's what people called her, but that wasn't who she was. Her real name was Zhu Shuhua, and the chief physician and his wife literally couldn't believe it because they had not given any information about their personal lives to Lynn. They've only listened to her story, and she's just offered up what she claims her name is. She's called them uncle and auntie, and wouldn't you know it, the chief physician and his wife, they did have a niece whose name was Zhu Shuhua, and a year earlier, she, their niece, had gone missing. She'd gone missing during the Chinese Civil War, and she had been presumed dead, but nobody had ever found her body. According to Lynn, Zhu did die during that war, She was robbed and murdered by a group of fishermen. And then after she was killed, her spirit was sort of stuck in this purgatory for some time. But then, a year after Zhu's death, when Lin died, Lin said that Zhu's spirit entered Lin's body, and thus, she came back to life, Zhu did, but in a different body. And so Lin basically was telling the chief physician and his wife that she was Zhu. She had been reincarnated in Lin's body. And as crazy as this story sounded, the chief physician and his wife couldn't help but notice that as Lin was speaking, her accent was exactly like Zhu's. In fact, just generally speaking, Lin was acting exactly like their niece. She really did seem like the reincarnated version of Zhu. And then when they dug deeper and spoke more to Lin and also her husband Wu, the physician and his wife learned that, Lin, when she woke up and was reincarnated, suddenly she was a vegetarian, just like Zhu. Suddenly, Lin was interested in accounting and bookkeeping. Well, that was something that Zhu was interested in. And also, the biggest one was that Lin had been illiterate, but then she wakes up and suddenly she reads and speaks Mandarin fluently, the language that Zhu read and spoke. And so the chief physician, he couldn't help but start to believe that maybe Lin was telling the truth here. Maybe this really was his niece's reincarnated spirit. And so, as sort of strange as it was, he told the Taiwanese government that, there's something weird happening here, and, I can't help but believe that maybe there's some truth to this story. But if we really want to pressure test it, Lin claims that she knows who killed my niece. Like, she knows who killed her, because now she's Zhu. She said it was this particular group of fishermen. And actually, Lin had given the names of these fishermen that apparently robbed and killed Zhu. And so the chief physician told the government, why don't we investigate my niece's disappearance as a murder and go talk to those fishermen and see if that holds up. And so that's what the government did. They tracked these fishermen down, but unfortunately, only one of them was still alive. But they interviewed this guy, and Lin would actually say that particular fisherman, he was not one of the aggressors. He was actually the only fisherman in the group who tried to save Zhu, even though obviously she did get killed, but that fisherman had tried to stop what was happening to her. And when the government talked to him, he would say that, yes, unfortunately, she was killed, and I did try to stop it, but I just couldn't. Keep in mind, this fisherman had not been given any information. This is entirely like a brand new investigation. He has no idea what they know. But he basically exactly mirrored what Lin said happened. And so based on this, they actually closed Zhu Shua's case. It was labeled a disappearance. They changed it to a murder, and they labeled her killers as the fishermen who were deceased at the time. But they were labeled as her killers, and they closed the case based entirely on, a reincarnated spirit's testimony. And there's one more thing. Back in the beginning of the story, when Wu is hustling home, biking as fast as he can to get to his sick wife, and he has those weird encounters with his neighbors, well, it would turn out when those neighbors were interviewed, they would say that the reason they gave those looks to Wu, those looks of disgust and disdain, is because, one, they knew Wu was married to Lin, and they were also aware that she was sick in bed. But here comes Wu pedaling up the road, and he's got this woman sitting on the back of his bike that is clearly not his wife. And so everyone's reaction to that is, Wu is having an affair on his poor wife who's sick in bed. What a horrible person. Now, Wu swore there was no woman on his bike, but he would recall that the bike did feel really heavy, like he was pulling extra weight at the end there. Later, Lin would say that actually Zhu's spirit had come down and hopped on the back of Wu's bike, and it was her basically riding along, hitching a ride up to their house. She was the woman that the neighbors were seeing. But Wu, he was so focused on getting home, even though he felt that heavy weight, he never turned around, and so he didn't see her. And then once Lin passed away, Zhu's spirit, who was now at the home, sort of waiting for this to happen, she switched places with her. For the rest of her life, Lin would live as Zhu, and she would become a community and spiritual leader. And she would pass away in 2018 at the age of 97, and at her funeral, there would be banners hung that actually said both names, Lin and Zhu. And so if reincarnation is real, this story might just be one of the most credible cases ever recorded. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now.
But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here.